HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Death of the Banker, the Decline and Fall of the Great Financial Dynasties, and the Triumph of the Small Investor, by Chernow. Read by Michael Kramer. Introduction. Sometimes authors are guilty of such excruciating subtlety that even their most faithful listeners fail to spot the themes artfully embedded in their work. Such, I fear, was the case with my two lengthy sagas of banking dynasties, the House of Morgan and the Warburgs. Some special pleading is in order. Since many people consider banking synonymous with boring, the financial historian is tempted to sugarcoat the pill with diverting tales and thick dollops of local color, sometimes obscuring underlying ideas. Having undertaken to write 2 plump banking tomes, I tried to keep my touch light in deference to the material's weight. Perhaps novelists picture their listeners curling up with their books in a fondly appreciative mood. I see my listeners as a moody, bad-tempered crew, stamping their feet and glancing impatiently at their watches. To appease them, I have tried to craft well-paced narratives with enough characters to populate a Dickens novel. Now, with some sense of unfinished business, I welcome the chance to exhume those buried themes. By design, my banking sagas have spanned more than a century of tumultuous events, for I wanted to depict both the heyday and the twilight of the financial gods. For the past decade, I have been intrigued by the conundrum of why the storied financial dynasties, the Rothschilds, Morgans, Barings, Warburgs, et al., flared so brilliantly at a certain historic juncture, then fell into eclipse. Why was their reign so spectacular but brief? These small, august private banks gave way to financial conglomerates that still proudly flaunt their predecessors' names and traffic in their inherited romantic histories as marketing tools. Nothing sells quite so well these days as a classy image. But the dynastic families have long since faded from view, along with the whole web of intimate relationships with companies and sovereign states that constituted the essence of their power. In this trio of essays, I try to explain why the financial dynasties have receded to the status of historic dinosaurs. That is, why they represent not a permanent feature of economic life, but a fleeting phase in the development of capitalist economies. My aim isn't to rummage in musty archives and evoke forgotten tycoons for their antiquated charm. The foremost banking dynasties tell us much about the shifting constellation of economic and political power. For this reason, I take their demise as my starting point for a panoramic survey of the world of high finance during the past 2 centuries. For all their majesty, the financial dynasties have been canaries in the coal mine, telling us much about unseen forces at work in the capital markets. The first piece in this book, entitled The Death of the Banker, was delivered in Toronto in April 1997 as the Barbara Frum Memorial Lecture. While the printed version is considerably longer than the spoken one, it expounds the same points, albeit embellished with more bells and whistles. For future historians, the salient fact of 20th-century finance will be the sharp erosion of banker power. That is, the dwindling role of the financial intermediary. Bankers are glorified go-betweens, conduits for capital flows. During the 20th century, they have progressively yielded power to providers of capital, both retail and institutional investors, on the one hand, and consumers of capital, notably large multinational corporations, on the other. And in the process, the banker's intermediary role in the financial equation has declined. A horrid term is sometimes employed to describe this phenomenon, disintermediation, but I will try as much as possible to avoid all such obfuscatory language and resort to plain English. Since banking is a word subject to many meanings, it might be useful to lodge a caveat here. I am dealing principally with the Olympian world of high finance, what the French call haute banque. The reader must banish mundane thoughts of automated tellers, car loans, home mortgages, and so on, and descend into the upper atmosphere of wholesale finance. This is the Tony world that caters to large companies, sovereign states, and high-net-worth individuals, once upon a time known as the rich. Many readers will say that I could have avoided unnecessary confusion by calling this book The Death of the Financier, and that the term banker here is a misleading misnomer. Yet I use the word precisely to avoid confusion and facilitate comparisons across time and space. Ever since the Glass-Steagall Act of the 1930s, American finance has been partitioned into commercial banks, which take deposits and make loans, and investment banks, which issue, trade, and distribute securities. Since our discussion shuttles between an old world innocent of such distinctions and a new world in which this nomenclature applies, banker seemed the best catch-all term. When I talk of banking in the modern era, I am usually referring to investment bankers, although I wanted the liberty to cite parallel developments in commercial banking. Once again, banking is a conveniently elastic term that can be stretched across a multitude of situations. This is especially true when I turn to Germany, where the system of universal banking never disappeared. Historically, the denizens of Haute Bank disdained the retail world of small investors and inhabited a separate, rarefied, hermetically sealed universe. The savings of small investors were considered too inconsequential to finance business or government, and they were duly snubbed by the top-hatted moneymen. During the past generation, the small investor has evolved, in striking fashion, from a bit player and pariah to the mainstay of global financial markets. This shift has been paralleled by a convergence of wholesale and retail finance. Hence our story originates in a vanished world of paunchy men with watch chains, striped pants, and thick cigars, and ends up with the modern mutual fund boom. Banded together in mutual funds, the meek have finally inherited the financial earth, as the American economy has evolved from one based on banker power to one centered in the stock market. In reprinting my Barbara Frum Memorial Lecture, Random House of Canada invited me to append 2 companion pieces. In response, I decided to revisit the House of Morgan and the Warburgs in supplementary essays that might serve to extend and illustrate the thesis of my Frum lecture. For those who have listened to those 2 sagas, I hope these essays will provide fresh insights and offer more than dehydrated morsels left over from the more ample spread they remember. Since J. Pierpont Morgan appears in the lecture and in the essay of the same name, I apologize to the listener in advance for a small amount of unavoidable repetition. Few people can resist the invitation to pontificate before an audience, and I would like to express my profound appreciation to David Frum and his family for giving me my hour to strut and amble upon the lecture stage. I'm also grateful to Doug Pepper of Random House of Canada and Marty Asher of Vintage Books, who provided the editorial enthusiasm that conquers a writer's midnight doubts. As always, I would also like to thank my agent, the indefatigable Melanie Jackson, and my lovely, long-suffering partner in crime, Valerie. My parents continue to provide inspiration by word and deed. Finally, I hope this volume helps to further honor the memory of the late Barbara Frum, one of the true giants of Canadian broadcasting. The Death of the Banker. 1. When I prophesy the death of the banker, I fear that instead of provoking weeping and lamentations, the news will be greeted by the heartless listener with a sigh of relief and loud, prolonged hosannas. For is there any creature on God's green earth so unloved as a banker? We envision him in stereotypical form as a grim, humorless man, in late middle age, with iron-gray hair, wire-rimmed spectacles, and a costive disposition. Of somber mien, with a permanent scowl on his face, he wears the dark monochromatic suits of a small-town funeral director. In this historical caricature, he seems a born misanthrope, who delights in saying no and rebuffing frivolous, unworthy enterprises. He maintains constant vigilance against the fuzzy claims and inflated numbers put forward by mischievous debtors whose principal object in life, or so he is firmly convinced, is to defraud him and bankrupt his institution. If the banker traditionally took this jaundiced view of human nature, it was because his assigned function in the financial cosmos was to ration scarce credit. Dispensing something rare and precious, He was perpetually on the defensive and had to be far more adept at spurning prospective borrowers than gratifying their fond wishes. But money has now become a banal commodity, available everywhere at the touch of a button or the flick of a computer switch. Money is literally everywhere. Automated telemachines line the streets, shopping malls, and airports as if they were vending machines selling soda, candy, or cigarettes. Retired baseball players hawk home equity loans in television commercials, and solicitations for new credit cards come cascading in with each day's mail. Even sinners who have filed for personal bankruptcy are instantly absolved by the financial priesthood and tenderly welcomed back into the fold. We inhabit an age of superabundant credit, and its purveyors, as with any other product manufactured in surplus, must advertise heavily to stimulate demand and soak up existing supply. In this essay I plan to meditate upon the metamorphosis of the banker in the 20th century, from the Spartan age of limited capital to our own hedonistic age of bountiful cash. I'm going to consider in particular the rise and fall of the great banking dynasties, the financial overlords of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and carry the story through to the unexpected triumph of the small mutual fund investor, the implausible tycoon of the late 20th century. When I talk of the death of the banker, the listener shouldn't picture the sallow, overworked teller at the corner bank, the one accustomed to moving in slow motion when he's in a rush, but rather someone more likely to sport red suspenders and Gucci loafers and waggle thick Cuban cigars. Yes, I'm referring to those people who take home obnoxious salaries, whose Christmas bonuses dwarf not just our annual salary, but our entire net worth, and who sometimes seem immune from normal human misery. These bankers scarcely seem crucified by recent financial developments. So how can I possibly suggest that this charmed breed, the darlings of the business media, belong to an endangered species? Don't we live in an age that fairly rings with the razzle-dazzle of big deals, the babble about mega-mergers, the omnipresence of the stock market in our culture? Aren't these people, if the truth be told, much too powerful? Once upon a time I was also impressed by the power and wealth of these youthful wheeler-dealers. Then, as I burrowed into my research for the House of Morgan, I began to dust off and resurrect the forgotten world of the fin de siècle bankers. Here I discovered sleek tycoons who held undisputed sway over transcontinental railroads, industrial trusts, investment houses, and estates the size of small duchies. They boasted yachts as big as battleships, smoked cigars as thick as small torpedoes, and treated presidents and prime ministers as peers, sometimes even condescended to them as the sovereigns of struggling inferior states. These men seemed to stand at the pinnacle not just of the financial world, but of society. For those few who have not listened to the House of Morgan cover to cover and committed it to memory, let me briefly evoke the incomparable splendor of Mr. J. Pierpont Morgan, 1837 to 1913, the senior partner of J.P. Morgan and Company, who was endowed with the nickname Jupiter on Wall Street. At the zenith of his splendor, Mr. Morgan controlled 1/3 of America's railroads, and this at a time when railroads comprised 60% of all the stocks on the New York Stock Exchange, and 19 of the 20 most actively traded bonds were railroad instruments. After the 1901 creation of U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation, he controlled about 70% of the steel industry and figured largely in the affairs of the 3 leading insurance companies. Besides the Morgan Bank, he reigned over Bankers Trust and Guarantee Trust, later folded into the Morgan Bank, and held major stakes in the banks that became Chase and Citicorp. When Morgan made the offhand remark, "America is good enough for me," the Commoner, the newspaper of populist William Jennings Bryan, was quick to retort, "Whenever you're tired of it, you can give it back." That was the popular image of J.P. Morgan, the harsh, flinty landlord of the United States, exacting his mite from every American. The listener will begin to see what I mean when I say that even the richest deal-makers and most overweening yuppies of today seem small and bland mortals beside a colossus such as Morgan. As I excavated the Morgan archives, I was forced to ask myself, how could a single individual amass such power? And why did it seem inconceivable that a contemporary financier could attain even a fraction of that fabled power? To elucidate this mystery, I spent a lot of time digging through dusty documents, blackening my hands with ancient soot, but I also engaged in a fair bit of daydreaming. Wandering around Wall Street or the London financial district, the City, I was intrigued by the old private banking houses, those impenetrable fortresses with thick walls and heavily draped windows, steeped in their own gloomy dignity and majesty. These historic buildings shared a telltale feature that intrigued me. They posted no nameplate, as if unwilling to divulge their identity to bemused pedestrians. At the corner of Broad and Wall in Lower Manhattan, the elegantly chiseled marble headquarters of J.P. Morgan & Company posted the number 23 on the door, and nothing else. This haughty reticence stood out in a land of hucksterism and high-pressure salesmanship, where businessmen seldom balk at trumpeting their presence. Why did these wholesale banks so brazenly defy the curious? Why did they wreathe themselves in unfathomable mystery? What kind of business shrank from public view? Everyone remembers the famous rosebud riddle in the movie Citizen Kane, the inscrutable last word croaked out by the dying Kane, that is the movie's central enigma. For me, the absence of nameplates on those old banking houses seemed the clue that might pry open the secret of how Morgan had gathered such immense power. Before embarking on a tour of some financial dynasties, I must pause and, at the risk of becoming a pedantic bore, burden the listener with an interpretive framework. So many different kinds of banking systems populate the financial bestiary that I needed some universal yardstick for comparing them. My solution has been to picture any financial system as represented by a simple graph with 3 bars. As the middleman, the eternal matchmaker, the wholesale banker naturally occupies the center position. He is forever suspended between the providers of capital, whether individual or institutional investors, and the consumers of capital, whether individual, business, or governmental borrowers. Any financial system, no matter how intricate, can be reduced to this crude, simplistic framework. Now, to gauge the changing strength of the banker, we cannot simply appraise the scope of his activities or the scale of his capital, the absolute standard applied daily in the business press. Rather, the banker's true power in any period depends upon his relative strength compared with that of the providers and consumers of capital. To take a commonplace example, in negotiating an offering of stocks and bonds, which party has the upper hand? The company issuing the securities, the banker underwriting it, or the investor absorbing it? As we make our long, winding, eventful excursion through financial history, the listener should try to keep that 3-bar graph before his mind's eye: the provider of capital, the banking intermediary, and the consumer of capital. Over time you will see some surprising changes, and in time you may understand my announced requiem for the banker. Now, armed with our analytic tool, let us set off on our journey. 2. It is a common adage in the financial world that money begets money, that money, in the archaic sense of the word, is prolific. In the last analysis, even the greatest bankers are perhaps no more than brilliant tricksters, puffed up with other people's money. Many would-be tycoons cherish the fancy that, if only some kindly stranger would come along and give them a sufficiently large endowment, they could inaugurate their own financial dynasty. So perhaps we should commence our tour with the fundamental question of how the leading financial dynasties obtained that all-important grubstake that first propelled them down the yellow brick road to riches. Let us start ab ovo. In the obscure dawn of high finance, banking was a mere byproduct of the world of trade, and took a long time to evolve into a discrete profession, consecrated by legal authorities with protective charters. Commodity merchants often advanced farmers' money against crop deliveries or extended loans against the security of merchandise left for safekeeping. That many top-lofty London banks still style themselves as merchant banks testifies to these distant origins. In fact, the illustrious merchant banks of the 19th century, besides brokering and discounting bills, traded commodities on their own account, and chartered and insured ships, sending argosies to distant ports. The natural progression from commerce to finance is worth mentioning here, for it left open the intriguing possibility that clients of merchant banks with surplus lendable funds might someday become rival banks themselves. As we have seen repeatedly in our own day, any successful business that engenders a large surplus is, potentially, an embryonic bank. In the absence of special regulatory restrictions, banking seems to spring spontaneously from other forms of economic activity. Even the Rothschilds, those counting-house wizards, couldn't manufacture money from thin air and had to find seed money. Recently, the Israeli historian Amos Elon published the first biography of the original Rothschild patriarch, Meyer Amschel Rothschild. It was he who sired the 5 gifted sons who fanned out across Europe and forged interlocking partnerships in Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples, a gilded diaspora celebrated by the 5 intertwined arrows of the family insignia. Operating from the sunless gloom and formidable stench of the Frankfurt ghetto, this first Rothschild was a resourceful businessman who dealt in rare coins and metals, antiques and curios, clothing, flour, and second-hand goods. Only slowly did his banking business emerge from this chaotic assemblage of businesses. In fact, banking didn't predominate in his varied product mix until 1810, 2 years before his death. The profits extracted from these diversified activities could never have provided the capital for a first-rate banking house. So, where did Rothschild get the money to become, well, a Rothschild? A century later, industrial enterprises would generate surplus capital, the sine qua non of any modern banking system. But at this more primitive stage of capitalist development, the taxing power of a despot was one of the few means to that end. Meyer Amschel found it necessary to grovel before the local nobleman, Wilhelm I, the Landgrave of Hesse, and the heir to an enormous fortune, who was, luckily for Rothschild, an avid coin collector. The Landgrave's imagination was fertile in figuring out ways to extort money from his hapless subjects. For instance, legend claims that every time he fathered another illegitimate child, he raised the salt tax so that mistress and love child could live in royal comfort. Since Wilhelm broadcast his seed liberally throughout the realm and could have single-handedly stocked a small orphanage, the size of his illegitimate brood ran as high as 70 children, according to one count. The populace constantly reeled from a sky-high salt tax. Devising new torments for his subjects, Wilhelm also auctioned off Hessian mercenaries to George III of England to suppress the American Revolution. If you're curious about the grisly arithmetic of the cannon fodder, Wilhelm charged 51 thaler per foot soldier and collected the same amount for each one killed in battle, presumably since each death deprived him of income for future sales. 3 wounded soldiers equaled 1 dead man and also fetched 51 thaler. Not a sweet-smelling fortune. As a man who needed to command a large pool of capital, Meyer Amschel had no choice but to bow and scrape before this fickle sovereign. His letters to the Landgrave reek with obsequious flattery, the shameless application of honorific titles that was de rigueur for courtiers in those days. The ambitious banker needed cloying adjectival artistry no less than a quick mind for numbers. With his decided flair for secrecy and intrigue, Rothschild undertook numerous confidential missions for the Landgrave. When Wilhelm was driven into exile by his refusal to join Napoleon's Confederation of the Rhine, Rothschild helped him to outwit the French occupation troops by hiding some of his patron's securities in his house, a place punctuated with more trap-doors, sliding panels, and secret compartments than a magician's trunk. Even Rothschild's carriage was honeycombed with hidden places to squirrel away money. Ultimately, Rothschild was rewarded with a near monopoly on negotiating the numerous and highly lucrative state loans issued by Wilhelm. From the perspective of 2 centuries, one is struck that this first Rothschild was so purely a creature of court intrigues, lacked corporate clients in his banking business, and seemed to engage almost exclusively in affairs of state. Nervous, insecure, and anxiety exacerbated by his precarious status as a Jew, he could only bask in the reflected glory of the Landgrave and had to be extremely submissive, even sycophantic, to retain royal favor. A proud man who had to endure unending snubs and neglectful treatment in silence, he suffered from the lopsided nature of his power relationship with his sovereign. Let us glance for a moment at our bar graph. At this point in history, the power of the capital provider, Wilhelm I, was infinitely greater than that of his agent, Rothschild, who could be snuffed out by an impatient grunt or pained grimace from his princely master. As for the consumers of Wilhelm's capital, the impoverished European noblemen who badgered him for loans, they had extremely circumscribed bargaining power in an era marked by a shortage of capital and chartered banks. I would like to leapfrog ahead to the 19th century to provide some vignettes that demonstrate the exalted place in European society that the Rothschilds soon attained. In the early 1840s, the German poet Heinrich Heine visited James de Rothschild in his Parisian office so that he could watch supplicants crook the knee and tug the forelock before the regal banker. According to Heine, potential clients fawned before Rothschild in so many contorted forms that this wriggling and twisting of the backbone would have been difficult for even the best of acrobats. One day he observed a Rothschild servant bearing a chamber pot down the corridor, and noted that a stock market speculator instinctively removed his hat in respect as the Rothschild waist passed by. Heine was convinced that any man with so little self-respect would surely end up a millionaire. Even heads of state would shortly truckle to the Rothschilds. During the Franco-Prussian War, the Prussians laid siege to Paris for nearly 4 months. During this dreadful time, desperate Parisians butchered zoo animals for meat and supped on assorted cats and rats. Determined to wait out the savagery in comfort, Kaiser Wilhelm, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, and General Helmut von Moltke retreated to the Rothschild chateau at Ferrières. Even the Kaiser was dazzled as he roamed around this vast domain, confiding, "Only a Rothschild could own all that." Bismarck, who spent many pleasant hours blasting Rothschild pheasants from the sky, was eager to wash down this tasty game with the owner's wine. When he questioned the caretaker, a retainer of the old school who would have submitted to the most exquisite torture rather than betray his master, he said that the estate did not contain a single bottle of wine. Bismarck, who was in France after all, was doubtful. After some prodding, the caretaker retracted his statement and admitted to having 100 bottles of Bordeaux in stock. When a still skeptical Bismarck demanded a search of the premises, his troops discovered 17,000 bottles in the cellar. Irate, Bismarck threatened to torch the whole place, then decided it was far wiser to sit down and savor the cache of wine. Within less than a century, the Rothschilds, once the officious servants of monarchs, had grown to be their equal, able to thumb their noses at the Kaiser, Bismarck, and other such minor luminaries on the European scene. 3. What had changed that allowed the Rothschilds to hurl insults and thunderbolts so freely and treat the loftiest politicos with undisguised condescension? How had they crept out from under the awful oppressive shadow of local sovereigns to stand forth as unrivaled magnificos in their own right? The plight of the Landgrave of Hesse, we should note, was an atypical case of a ruler swimming in surplus cash and urgently needing a banker to invest it. By allowing Rothschild to lend this money circumspectly, off in the wings, the Landgrave could obtain the maximum return without ruffling the feathers of patrician relatives who might have naively expected preferential terms. Unencumbered by the baggage of royal feuds, The private banker could obey a strict economic calculus and ignore political distractions. If trouble arose, the ruler could always throw up his hands in mock horror and feigned impotence, and disclaim all knowledge of the rash actions of his headstrong banker.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?